James couldn't help but feel nervous as he pulled into the driveway of his childhood home. 5 years had passed since he'd been back, and much had changed. His divorce finalized just 3 months ago. He found himself at 32 with nowhere else to go but back to start over. The house looked different: fresh paint, new flower beds, and a wind chime that definitely wasn't there when his mother was alive. His father had remarried last year to a woman named Lisa. James had missed the wedding due to work commitments. At least that's what he told himself. The truth was, he wasn't ready to see someone take his mother's place. James grabbed his suitcase from the trunk and walked slowly to the front door. Before he could knock, it swung open. There stood Lisa, a warm smile on her face. She was in her early 40s with kind eyes and shoulder-length brown hair. She wore a simple apron over jeans and a t-shirt, and the smell of fresh baking wafted out from behind her. "You must be James," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I've heard so much about you." James nodded politely, trying not to show his discomfort. "Nice to finally meet you, Lisa. Your father's very sorry he couldn't be here," Lisa explained as she led him inside. "The business trip came up suddenly. He'll be back next week." James tried to hide his disappointment. He had hoped his father would be there to make this less awkward. "I've got the guest room ready for you," Lisa continued, "and dinner will be ready in about an hour. I hope you like lasagna." "Lasagna sounds great," James replied, following her up the stairs. The guest room had once been his bedroom. Now it was painted a soft blue with new furniture. Nothing remained of his childhood there. "I'll let you get settled," Lisa said. "Come down whenever you're ready." Alone in the room, James sat on the bed and sighed deeply. He unpacked slowly, placing his clothes in the dresser and setting a framed photo of himself and his ex-wife Emmy on the nightstand. Looking at it now, he wondered why he'd kept it. An hour later, James made his way downstairs, drawn by the delicious smell coming from the kitchen. He paused in the doorway, watching Lisa as she moved around the space with easy confidence. The kitchen had been completely remodeled since he'd last been home. Lisa looked up and smiled when she noticed him. "Perfect timing. Can you set the table?" "Plates are in that cabinet." James did as she asked, and they worked in silence for a few minutes. "So," Lisa said as they sat down to eat, "your father tells me you're an architect." "That's right," James replied, taking a bite of the lasagna. It was possibly the best he'd ever tasted. "This is delicious." "Thank you," Lisa beamed. "I used to be a professional chef before I started writing cookbooks." "Cookbooks?" James asked, suddenly interested despite himself. "I've published 3 so far," she explained, mostly focusing on updating classic recipes with modern techniques. "The 4th one is due to my publisher next month." James nodded, impressed despite his determination to keep his distance. "That's quite an accomplishment." They ate in silence for a moment before Lisa spoke again. "I know this must be strange for you. Coming back home, meeting me, your father not being here." James looked up, surprised by her directness. "A little," he admitted. "I want you to know I'm not trying to replace your mother," Lisa said softly. "Your father talks about her often. She sounds like she was an amazing woman." James felt a lump in his throat. She was. "And I'm not trying to be your new mom either," Lisa continued with a small smile. "I'd just like us to be friends, if that's possible." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After dinner, James insisted on helping with the dishes. As they worked side by side, he gradually began to relax. Lisa didn't push for conversation, but when they did talk, it felt easier than he expected. Later that night, as James lay in bed, he reflected on the day. Lisa wasn't at all what he had expected. He'd imagined some kind of stepmother from a fairy tale, cold and trying too hard. Instead, she seemed genuine and kind. As he drifted off to sleep, James realized that for the first time since his divorce, he wasn't thinking about Amy. Instead, his mind was filled with the warmth of Lisa's smile and the comforting smell of her kitchen. Maybe coming home wasn't going to be as bad as he'd feared. The next morning, James woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen. He checked his phone. It was already past 9. He hadn't slept this well in months. After a quick shower, he made his way downstairs. Lisa stood at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she flipped pancakes. She wore a simple sundress, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the honey-colored highlights in her hair. "Good morning," James said, suddenly aware he was staring. Lisa turned and smiled. Well, look who's finally awake. I was beginning to think you might sleep all day. Sorry, James said, taking a seat at the counter. I guess I needed the rest. No need to apologize, you're on vacation sort of. She slid a mug of coffee toward him. Black, right? Your dad mentioned that's how you take it. James nodded, surprised his father remembered such a detail. Thanks. Lisa served up a plate of pancakes, bacon, and eggs, placing it in front of him. Eat up. I have plans for us today. James raised an eyebrow as he took a bite of pancake. It was perfectly fluffy, with just the right amount of sweetness. Plans. Well, your father mentioned you might be staying a while, and I thought. Lisa paused, looking suddenly unsure. I thought maybe you'd like to learn some basic cooking skills. Your father says you live on takeout and frozen meals. James felt his cheeks grow warm. Dad talks about me a lot, it seems. Lisa laughed. He's proud of you, but worried about your diet. James couldn't help but smile. Fair enough. I'm a disaster in the kitchen. So what do you say? Cooking lessons with your stepmom. Lisa's eyes twinkled with amusement. Something about the way she said stepmom made James's stomach flip in an unexpected way. He pushed the feeling aside. Sure, why not? I've got nothing but time these days. After breakfast, Lisa cleared the table and pulled out several ingredients from the refrigerator. We'll start with something simple, pasta with homemade sauce. James stood beside her at the counter, watching as she demonstrated how to chop an onion. When it was his turn, he fumbled with the knife, his fingers feeling too big and clumsy. Here, Lisa said, stepping behind him. Like this. She placed her hands over his, guiding the knife. Her body was warm against his back, and he caught the faint scent of her perfume, something light and floral. James swallowed hard. I think I've got it now, he said, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. Lisa stepped away, and James immediately missed her warmth. He focused intently on chopping the onion, willing himself to get a grip. This was his father's wife, for heaven's sake. As they continued cooking, the kitchen grew warm. James rolled up his sleeves, noticing Lisa's glance at the tattoo on his forearm. A design he'd gotten after his divorce. Nice ink, she said, stirring the sauce. What does it mean? It's a phoenix, James explained. Rising from the ashes and all that. Seemed fitting after the divorce. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. I like it. Shows you're resilient. Their eyes met for a moment, and James felt something shift in the air between them. Lisa looked away first, focusing back on the sauce. My ex never liked cooking, James said, breaking the silence. She said it was a waste of time. Lisa looked up in surprise. Really? That's sad. There's something so intimate about preparing food for someone you care about. Her cheeks flushed slightly. I mean, it's a way of showing love, isn't it? James hadn't thought about it that way before. I guess so. My mom used to cook all the time. Your father's told me how wonderful she was, Lisa said softly. I wish I could have known her. James felt an unexpected lump in his throat. She would have liked you, he said, surprising himself with the admission. Lisa smiled, her eyes warm. That means a lot, James. They finished cooking in companionable silence. When they finally sat down to eat, James took his first bite and closed his eyes in appreciation. This is amazing, and I actually helped make it. You're a natural, Lisa said, her smile making her eyes crinkle at the corners. As they ate, James found himself telling Lisa about his job, his friends, even details about his failed marriage that he'd never shared with anyone. There was something about her that made him feel comfortable, understood. When they finished eating, James helped clear the dishes. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same plate, and James felt a jolt of electricity run through him. He pulled back quickly, nearly dropping the plate. Lisa caught it, her fingers brushing his again. Careful, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. For the next few days, cooking with Lisa became the highlight of James's routine. Each morning he woke with a strange anticipation, counting the hours until their afternoon lessons. Today was their third session, and Lisa had promised to teach him how to make her famous marinara sauce. James found himself paying extra attention to his appearance before heading downstairs. He chose a blue button-down shirt that an ex-girlfriend once said brought out his eyes. He caught himself in this thought and shook his head, wondering why he suddenly cared what Lisa might think of him. When he entered the kitchen, Lisa was already there, her hair tied back with a few loose strands framing her face. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans with an apron tied around her waist. Right on time, she smiled, looking up from the tomatoes she was washing, ready to learn the secret to the perfect marinara. As ready as I'll ever be, James replied, washing his hands at the sink beside her. Their arms brushed, and he felt that now familiar flutter in his stomach. The secret, Lisa said, handing him a knife and a cutting board, is using fresh ingredients and having patience. Good sauce can't be rushed. They worked side by side, chopping tomatoes, garlic, and herbs. Lisa showed him how to saute the garlic just right, until it's fragrant but not brown. The kitchen filled with delicious aromas as the sauce began to simmer. Now we stir occasionally and wait, Lisa said, wiping her hands on her apron. Like I said, patience. Patience has never been my strong suit, James admitted. That doesn't surprise me, Lisa laughed. Your father said you were always in a hurry, even as a child. James found himself smiling. He's right. I broke my arm when I was 10 because I couldn't wait for him to help me climb a tree. Lisa's eyes widened. He never told me that story. Probably because he blames himself, James said. He was supposed to be watching me, but he was distracted by work calls. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. He works too much. Always has, from what I can tell. That's part of what ended my marriage, James found himself saying. I followed in his footsteps a little too closely. A comfortable silence fell between them as James stirred the sauce. After a moment, Lisa spoke again. What was she like, your ex-wife? James considered the question. No one had asked him about Amy in such a direct way before. She was ambitious, smart, beautiful. He paused. But we wanted different things in the end. I'm sorry, Lisa said softly, her hand briefly touching his arm. Even through his sleeve, her touch sent warmth spreading through him. Don't be, James said, surprised to find he meant it. It was for the best. Lisa nodded and reached past him for the wooden spoon to check the sauce. As she did, a strand of her hair brushed his cheek. She was so close he could smell her perfume mingled with the scent of the simmering garlic and tomatoes. Your turn to stir, she said, offering him the spoon. As James took it, their fingers touched. He looked up to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then everything happened at once. James turned too quickly, his elbow catching the pot handle. The large pot of marinara sauce tipped, splattering red everywhere, on the counters, the floor, and all over both of them. Oh my God, James exclaimed, horrified as he saw Lisa's white blouse covered in red sauce. I'm so sorry. He expected anger, irritation, or at least disappointment. Instead, Lisa looked down at her sauce-covered self and burst into laughter. Your face, she gasped between laughs. You look like you just committed murder. James stared at her in disbelief, then looked down at himself. His blue shirt was splattered with red sauce that indeed looked alarmingly like blood. The absurdity of it hit him, and he began to laugh too. Soon they were both doubled over, laughing so hard tears streamed down their faces. When James finally caught his breath, he noticed a smear of sauce on Lisa's cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and wiped it away with his thumb. Their laughter faded. Lisa's eyes met his, wide and surprisingly vulnerable. James's hand lingered on her face a moment too long before he pulled away. We should clean this up, he said quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. Lisa nodded, a slight flush on her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the kitchen. Yes, we should. As they worked together to clean the sauce-covered kitchen, something had shifted between them. Their hands would brush as they passed each other cloths and cleaning supplies, and each time, James felt a jolt of electricity that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. By the time his father returned from his trip, James knew he was in trouble, the kind of trouble he'd never expected to find in his father's kitchen, with his father's wife. James's father, Robert, had been home for 3 days now, and the house felt different. The morning cooking lessons with Lisa had been replaced by quick breakfasts where Robert rushed out the door with a travel mug of coffee. The evenings were filled with polite conversation about business and local news. James missed the easy connection he had formed with Lisa in those few days alone. Now when their eyes met across the dinner table, she would quickly look away, focusing on her plate or turning to ask Robert a question. On Thursday evening, Robert announced he had to leave again for a business trip to Chicago. "It's just for the weekend," he explained, squeezing Lisa's hand. "I'll be back Sunday night." James felt a flicker of something he didn't want to name. Guilt, anticipation, confusion, all mixed together. "Will you two be all right without me?" Robert asked, looking between them. "Of course," Lisa answered quickly. "James and I get along just fine. Don't we, James?" There was something in her voice, a slight tremor perhaps, that made James look up. "Yeah, we're good," he said, meeting her eyes. This time she didn't look away. The next morning, after Robert had left for the airport, James came downstairs to find Lisa in the kitchen, surrounded by ingredients. "I thought we could continue your cooking lessons," she said with a small smile. "If you're still interested." "Definitely," James replied, too quickly. They fell back into their routine as if the days with Robert home had been just a brief interruption. Lisa showed him how to make bread, guiding his hands as he kneaded the dough. "You need to be firm but gentle," she explained, her hands over his. "Like this." Her touch sent warmth up his arms, and he found himself leaning back slightly, his back brushing against her front. Neither of them moved away. As the bread baked, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, they sat at the counter drinking coffee. "Can I ask you something personal?" James said, looking into his mug rather than at her. "Of course," Lisa replied. "Are you happy? With my father, I mean." The question hung in the air between them. James immediately regretted asking it. "I'm sorry, that was out of line," he said quickly. "No, it's a fair question," Lisa said softly. She was quiet for a moment. "Your father is a good man. He's kind, successful, stable." James noticed she hadn't actually answered his question. "But are you happy?" he pressed. Lisa sighed. "Marriage isn't just about happiness, James. It's about partnership, compromise." She paused. "Your father and I want different things sometimes. He loves his work. I understand that." "That doesn't answer my question," James said gently. Lisa finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his directly. "I could be happier," she admitted. "But couldn't we all?" Something shifted in the air between them. James found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something he couldn't resist. "What would make you happier?" he asked, his voice low. Lisa's eyes dropped to his lips, then back up to his eyes. "Things I shouldn't want," she whispered. The timer for the bread beeped loudly, making them both jump. Lisa quickly moved to the oven, slipping on mitts to take out the golden loaf. "Perfect timing," she said, her voice overly bright. "Let's let this cool before we slice it." They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully avoiding the moment that had nearly happened, talking about safe topics like recipes and James's work projects, but every time their hands brushed or their eyes met, the electricity between them intensified. After dinner, they moved to the living room with glasses of wine. Lisa put on some music, soft jazz that filled the room with warm, intimate sounds. "I've enjoyed these cooking lessons," James said, sitting closer to her on the couch than was strictly necessary. "Me too," Lisa replied, taking a sip of her wine. "It's been nice having someone to cook with." "Is that all it's been?" James asked, courage from the wine flowing through him. Lisa set down her glass and turned to face him fully. "You know it's not," she said quietly. "But James, this is complicated. You're my husband's son." "Stepson," he corrected. "Still," she sighed, "it's not right." "What if it feels right?" James asked, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. Lisa closed her eyes at his touch, leaning into his hand slightly. "It doesn't matter how it feels," she whispered, though she made no move to pull away. "Doesn't it?" James murmured, leaning closer until their foreheads nearly touched. For a long moment they stayed that way, breathing the same air, hovering on the edge of something they both knew they shouldn't want but couldn't seem to resist. Finally, Lisa pulled back, standing up abruptly. "We should get some sleep," she said, her voice unsteady. "It's getting late." Saturday morning arrived with a heavy tension hanging in the air. James woke early, staring at the ceiling as sunlight filtered through the curtains. He hadn't slept much, his mind replaying the almost moment with Lisa over and over again. When he finally made his way downstairs, the kitchen was empty. A note sat on the counter in Lisa's elegant handwriting: "Gone to the farmer's market. Back soon." James made himself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, unsure what to do with himself. Part of him wanted to pack his bags and leave before she returned, to remove himself from this impossible situation. Another part, the part he was trying desperately to ignore, wanted to stay right where he was and wait for her. The sound of the front door opening made him look up. Lisa walked in carrying several bags of fresh produce. Her cheeks were flushed from the morning air, her hair slightly wine-brown. She'd never looked more beautiful. "You're up," she said, setting the bags on the counter. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be sleeping." "Couldn't sleep much," James admitted. Lisa nodded, unpacking the groceries without looking at him. "Me neither." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. James stood and moved to help her with the bags. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same tomato, and this time neither pulled away. "Lisa," James said softly, "we need to talk about last night." She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "What is there to say, James? We almost made a terrible mistake." "Did it feel like a mistake to you?" he asked. Lisa closed her eyes briefly. What it feels like and what it is are two different things. James moved closer. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice low. "I know it's wrong, I know we shouldn't, but—" "Don't," Lisa interrupted, placing her hand on his chest to stop him from coming closer. But she didn't remove it, instead letting it rest over his heart, which was pounding beneath her palm. "Your father trusts us both." "I know," James whispered, covering her hand with his own. "I've never been in this situation before. I've never felt this way about someone I shouldn't want." Lisa looked up at him, her resolve visibly weakening. "James, The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the tension. Lisa jumped back as if burned, rushing to answer it. James watched as her expression changed while she listened to the caller. "Yes, he's right here," she said, her eyes meeting James across the room. "It's your father," she mouthed, holding out the phone. James took it, his heart still racing. "Hey, Dad." "James, good to hear your voice," Robert said. "How are things at home?" "Fine," James replied, watching as Lisa busied herself with the groceries, her back to him now. "Everything's fine." "Good, good. Listen, I've had a change of plans. The meeting finished early, so I'm catching a flight back today instead of tomorrow. I should be home by dinner." James felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. "That's great, Dad. We'll see you tonight then." After hanging up, he turned to Lisa. "He's coming home tonight." She nodded, not looking up from the vegetables she was arranging in the fridge. "I heard." James moved closer to her again. "Lisa, this doesn't change what's happening between us." "Nothing is happening between us, James," she said firmly, finally turning to face him. "Nothing can happen. Your father will be home in a few hours, and we are going to act normal, because we are normal, just as Stepson and his father's wife." The way she said it made it sound so clinical, so cold. But her eyes told a different story. They were filled with the same conflict he felt. "Is that really what you want?" he asked quietly. Lisa's composure cracked just slightly. "What I want doesn't matter," she whispered. "Some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter how tempting it might be." James reached out, gently touching her cheek. "And if they've already been crossed in our minds, in our hearts?" A single tear slipped down Lisa's cheek. "Then we need to uncross them," she said, stepping away from his touch. "Before your father gets home. Before we do something we can't take back." The house felt different with Robert home again. The easy flow that had existed between James and Lisa was replaced by careful movements, strategic positioning to avoid accidental touches, and conversations that never strayed beyond the weather or local news. 3 days had passed since their almost moment in the kitchen, 3 days of stolen glances across the dinner table, 3 days of James lying awake at night, wrestling with his conscience and his heart. On Wednesday evening, Robert announced he had a surprise. "I've booked a table at Riverside for Friday night," he said proudly, "to thank you both for putting up with my constant traveling. The best restaurant in town deserves the best company." Lisa smiled at her husband, though James noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That sounds lovely, dear." Later that night, James couldn't sleep. He made his way downstairs for a glass of water, surprised to find the kitchen light already on. Lisa sat at the counter, a cup of tea between her hands, staring into space. "Can't sleep either?" James asked softly. She looked up, startled. James, I didn't hear you come down. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, keeping a careful distance between them. What's keeping you up? Lisa sighed, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger. I've been thinking about my life, the choices I've made. She looked up at him. The choices I'm still making. Something in her voice made James's heart race. What do you mean? I married your father because he was stable, kind, established, she said quietly. After my first marriage fell apart, I wanted security. Robert gave me that. James moved to sit beside her, close but not touching. But I didn't expect to feel. She trailed off, looking at him with eyes that said everything her words couldn't. I know, James whispered. I didn't expect this either. For a moment they sat in silence, the tension between them almost unbearable. I should go back upstairs, Lisa finally said, though she made no move to leave. You should, James agreed, equally stationary. Their eyes met, and in that moment, James knew they were both thinking the same thing, how easy it would be to close the distance between them, to give in to what they'd both been feeling. Lisa broke the spell first, standing abruptly. This isn't right, James. Your father loves you. He loves me too, in his way. Does he make you happy? James asked, the question that had been burning in him for days. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. He's a good man. That's not what I asked. He's given me everything I thought I wanted, she said carefully. James stood, moving closer to her. But not what you need. Lisa closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. James, please, don't make this harder. He reached out, gently wiping the tear from her face. I never meant for this to happen. I came here to rebuild my life after my divorce, not to complicate yours. I know, she whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. The house creaked above them. The sound of Robert getting out of bed. Lisa jumped back as if burned, and James quickly moved to the sink, pretending to rinse his glass. Robert appeared in the doorway moments later, hair rumpled from sleep. Everything all right down here? Just getting some water, James said casually. And I couldn't sleep, so I made tea. Lisa added, her voice impressively steady. Robert nodded, seemingly satisfied. Don't stay up too late, you two. Good night. As he disappeared back upstairs, James and Lisa exchanged a look of shared relief and guilt. That was close, James whispered. Lisa nodded, setting her mug in the sink. Too close. This can't happen again, James. We can't be alone together like this. I know you're right, he said, though every part of him disagreed. I can't stop feeling what I feel. Neither can I, she admitted softly. And that's why I've made a decision. She took a deep breath. After the dinner on Friday, I'm going to visit my sister for a while. I need space to think, to remember who I am and what matters. James felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. How long will you be gone? I don't know, Lisa answered honestly. As long as it takes to get past this. She reached out, briefly touching his hand. As long as it takes for both of us to do the right thing. Before James could respond, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the lingering warmth of her touch. Friday night arrived too quickly. James spent the day in a fog, dreading the dinner that would be Lisa's last night before leaving. He dressed carefully in a black button-down and slacks, trying not to think about how this might be the last time he would see her for weeks, maybe months. When he came downstairs, Lisa and Robert were already waiting. Lisa wore a simple navy dress that hugged her curves, her hair swept up to reveal the elegant line of her neck. Their eyes met briefly, a world of unspoken words passing between them. Ready to go? Robert asked cheerfully, oblivious to the tension. The restaurant was everything Robert had promised, elegant without being stuffy, with soft lighting and discreet service. They were seated at a corner table with a view of the river. James found himself directly across from Lisa, with Robert at the head of the table. Throughout dinner, James tried to focus on his father's stories about his business trip, but his eyes kept drifting to Lisa. She laughed at all the right moments, asked all the right questions, played the perfect wife. But James could see the sadness hidden behind her smile, visible only to someone who had learned to read her as he had. After the main course, Robert excused himself to take a phone call from a client. As soon as he was out of earshot, James leaned forward. You don't have to go, he said quietly. Lisa looked down at her half-empty wine glass. Yes, I do. We both know that. What if? There is no what if, James, she interrupted gently. Your father loves you. I'm his wife. Some lines can't be crossed. Even if we both want to cross them, James challenged. Lisa finally looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Especially then. Before James could respond, Robert returned, smiling as he sat back down. Sorry about that. Now, who's ready for dessert? The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. James barely tasted the chocolate cake he ordered, barely heard the conversation flowing around him. All he could focus on was the knowledge that Lisa would be gone tomorrow, taking with her something he'd only just found. When they arrived home, Robert announced he was tired and headed upstairs first. Lisa lingered in the living room, pretending to tidy up some magazines. What time do you leave tomorrow? James asked, keeping his distance though every part of him wanted to move closer. Early, she replied. My flight's at 7. James nodded, unable to find the right words. What could he say? Don't go. Leave my father for me? None of it was right. None of it was possible. I've left you some recipes, Lisa said, filling the silence. In a binder in the kitchen, so you can keep practicing. Thank you, James said, the ordinary words feeling wholly inadequate. Lisa finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time all evening. James, I need to tell you something. He moved closer, hope and fear warring in his chest. What is it? These past weeks with you, she began, then stopped, gathering herself. They've reminded me what it feels like to really connect with someone, to be seen, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Lisa, please let me finish, she said softly. What happened between us? What almost happened, it wasn't right. But it wasn't wrong either, not in the way that matters. In another life, another time, she trailed off, the implication clear. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. I wish we'd met differently. So do I, she whispered. But we didn't, and we have to live in the reality we have, not the one we wish for. From upstairs they heard Robert call Lisa's name. I should go, she said, though she made no move to leave. I know, James replied, equally stationary. For a long moment, they stood there, the space between them filled with everything they couldn't say, couldn't do. Finally, Lisa stepped forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, lingering just a moment too long to be entirely innocent. Goodbye, James, she whispered against his skin. Goodbye, Lisa, he replied, letting her go because he had no other choice. As she walked away, climbing the stairs to the bedroom she shared with his father, James touched his cheek where her lips had been. It wasn't a happy ending, it wasn't really an ending at all. But as he stood there in the quiet living room, he realized some stories aren't meant to end, they simply pause, waiting for another time, another place, another chance.